subject of Mike Crapo came up a few minutes ago on the program, and people, I think, still believe that we don't agree with anybody politically, to my knowledge, 100%. The only person that would be 100% agreement with you would be yourself. And so, for the most part, I agree wholeheartedly on just about every issue with Mike Crapo and Jim Risch, Raul Labrador. Uh, and to some extent, I have to admit, even to a degree, Mike Simpson, even though, as I said, he could be in the witness protection program, nobody ever sees him. Still, there is a Republican committee in Kootenai County that has voted, and it was close, but they voted, and their resolution doesn't have any binding, it's not legal or anything like that, but they voted and they said that they essentially disagree with Mr. Crapo because he helped put together a bill to add additional sanctions against Russia. And a lot of people out there are looking at this and saying, is this necessary? I think it's a question that has to be asked because the Chinese are building islands in the Pacific, and they're going to interfere with our sea lanes that we think are our sea lanes. And they're annoying their neighbors in Japan, and, well, they never considered Taiwan to be an independent country, but they're annoying even old allies in places like Vietnam and the like because of their actions. And North Korea says it's going to start incinerating our cities. Not that we do anything with North Korea much when it comes to the way of trade, but we don't have sanctions against China, and the Chinese are far worse people than the Russians happen to be. But, we sell them more stuff, and they sell us a lot of stuff. Russia doesn't do that. This is Mike Crapo speaking on the floor of the U.S. Senate, claiming that the American people would like Russia to be slapped. I was unaware of this, but he says it's so.
The need for this legislation was underlined by the fact that many Americans have deep concerns about Russia's behavior over the past few years. Since coming to power, Russian President Putin has become increasingly belligerent, nationalistic, and autocratic. Currently, the United States has imposed sanctions on Russia for Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea and its role in supporting the separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, Russia's increasing cyber attacks and cyber espionage against the United States, Russia's support for the Assad regime in Syria, and Russia's complicity for corruption.
All right. It's like saying that our government is never corrupt. All right. That's a laugher. Number one, when he says that Putin is nationalistic, when our president says America first and he says Pittsburgh before Paris when it comes to a climate agreement, that's nationalistic. I like that. So when Putin says Russia first and, well, wait a minute now, you don't want to upset God's country, the USA. We're going to make Vladimir say, I surrender to the USA. And then when we talk about what happened in Crimea, again, there's a major Russian base there. If the Japanese tomorrow said we couldn't have access to Okinawa, our base is there, do you think that that would go over like a lead balloon? Or if the Cubans suddenly cut off Guantanamo Bay? Because that's what the Ukrainians did. Also, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama had propped up a pro-Ukrainian regime, which was also a very anti-Russian regime. And Mr. Putin took exception to that. It's right on his doorstep. So when I hear these types of arguments being made by people, they tend to forget any of that land that Russia took back had actually been Russian, but after Stalin died, the Soviet government, out of a guilt, I guess, because Stalin had starved 10 million Ukrainians, the Soviet government gave some of that land to Ukraine instead of Russia, because at the time they were all just Soviet socialist republics. So to ignore history in all of this, oh, Russia's bad, 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 bad. Going into Syria and fighting against ISIS, bad, 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 bad. Fighting Islamic terrorists, bad, 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 bad. I'm getting a little sick of it. And these guys who are still fighting the Cold War, which ended nearly 30 years ago, they got to come up with something new. Crapo, I guess, is looking to reinstitute duck and cover.
It demonstrates the lengths to which Russia will go to seize power and influence in the international arena. Unfortunately, Putin's desire to increase Russia's political influence is not driven by a desire to raise the standard of living for Russians. Instead, it is driven by a craving to enrich and empower himself and his cronies.
How dare he try and make money? How dare his friends try and make money? Because, nobody in the United States ever tries to do that. Nobody in politics ever uses their public office and profits from it. Never, never, never. 9/11. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 736-0300. Caller? No, I'm going to have to move to another line then. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air. Good morning.
Hello.
Yes, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. I apologize. First of all, I didn't get you turned on very early this morning, but I did catch a little bit of what you were talking about recently, and it was a lot of things that I have seen and I do have concerns about. I did work for a time for the government, and I spent the last several years of that working in D.C., so I got to see a lot of the most recent things that have been going on. So far as the comments that have been made about Mr. Crapo and Mr. Simpson, anybody back there in D.C., you've got to look at the voting records, and those voting records are available on the Internet. You cannot go by what they say.
Yeah.
The voting records is what tells.
Yeah.
Now, someone made an interesting comment to me recently. I'd only heard this once, and I did hear it from somebody back in Virginia, and they made the comment that, it's time for Trump to realize that the Republican Party and the establishment is not doing a thing for him, and they're never going to do a thing for him. And they were talking about, they thought it was time for Trump to realize it's time to maybe get together with the Freedom Caucus and do a new party.
I think it's a good possibility something like that can happen. And we had a guest on last week talking about something called the Federalist Party or the Constitution Party. Maybe one of those could pick up the mantle.
Well, I don't know. There is a group out there, and I cannot remember the name of it. It's like a PAC, like a think tank that supports these Freedom Caucus, used to be called maybe Tea Party candidates, and they've done a very good job of vetting them and getting some good candidates up there, and I just cannot think right now what the name of that group is, but I do know that Jim DeMint has also done a lot of work along that line.
Right. He was with the Heritage Foundation until recently, and now he's with some other think tank. I saw him on TV the other day, and the think tank was named, but the name has slipped my mind since then.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's the new group that was mentioned about doing all this good vetting recently with Freedom Caucus candidates or not. That is probably something that we could look up and find out. I don't know really what needs to be done here locally in Idaho. I've not been back from the D.C. area that long, but something definitely needs to be done because your Idaho representatives are not doing what Idaho wants them to once they get to D.C. And they've got to be handed the same message that you mentioned Cantor. Cantor was handed that message in Virginia, and because he was one of the first establishment candidates to get hit like that, it was such a surprise to him, he did not know what was coming. When that went through, that was a huge surprise to him. He had no idea.
But then he turned around and he's now making 10 times as much working as a lobbyist.
And that's fine, but you know what? That's part of our system that needs to be worked on, and you're not going to get that system fixed with the people that are in D.C. right now because you're talking about Simpson. I don't care whether it's Simpson, Crapo, or whoever else it is. All they have to do is get elected once, and they are set for life, and they know that. And it has been proven that name recognition is the most important thing on the ballot to get you reelected. So once you're elected the first time, your chances of going back every time you run just increases. Crapo's been riding this train for a long time. He needs to go, just like Simpson needs to go. It's time to get some Freedom Caucus people in there that have got the spine to do what they actually say they're going to do.
Would you,
Now,
a fellow like Russ Fulcher, of course, running in northern Idaho, I think is likely going to pick up that seat. But when we talk about Mike Simpson, it seems to me, I think I read where the American Conservative Union gave him less than a 50% score, which, if you're a Republican, that's pretty poor. It seems to me that he's really just a Democrat who realized if he was running as a Republican, he could win. But if he actually showed his true stripes in the beginning, but it just seems to me every time I've heard about people who challenged him, the problem is a lot of the people who've challenged him in the past just didn't resonate enough with the public. And maybe we need people who have at least a calmer presence, but still hold those Freedom Caucus. Someone like a Russ Fulcher in southern Idaho who looks the part, sounds the part, isn't going to come off as being half-cocked all the time, could run against Mike Simpson and perhaps take him out in a primary.
well, you know these guys better than I do. Like I said, I haven't been back here long enough to really follow it. I just know something has to be done. Now, on a totally different subject that you were not talking about, but I would like to bring up.
Sure.
Obamacare. Because I was back there and because I was involved at the time this was coming about and being put into practice, there's a lot about Obamacare that people here do not know. It really needs to be 100% repealed. And all of its tentacles that reach everywhere needs to be repealed. Obamacare, you know it as the ACA or the Affordable Care Act, whatever that is, but it is more than that. They put into the omnibus bill before the ACA was passed the administrative, setting up the administrative portion of Obamacare. Part of Obamacare that people do not realize is that administratively, other organizations other than the IRS now have the ability, if they have need or whatever, to know what is being reported on your IRS return for the health care information.
I was aware of that. Yeah.
They can request your return.
Well, I've got to let you.
If you're aware of that, you're the first person in Idaho I've come across that's aware of that.
I've got to let you run because I've got a hard break coming up. But thank you for the input.
Okay, that needs to be discussed more. Not enough people know it.
Super.
Everybody
Thank you.
in Washington, D.C. now has access to your IRS return.
Thank you very much. Interesting to get somebody who's an insider on the air every now and then because they can dish the dirt. And as she said, if you don't know about it, it might be time that you educate yourself on it. In other words, get involved. I was thinking about that this morning, even before I left the house, doing some reading in preparation for the show, that we need, and I don't have a problem. I love the phone calls, but we need more people. You know, you sound off on the radio. That's great. But a lot of these people just discount it as being, well, look at McCain's comments about talk radio the other day. There's got to be, you got to get beyond that. We all have to. Some of you do. God bless you, but we all have to get much, much more involved and deeper into this. What really has me concerned about the future is a column I read today from a writer named Selena Zitto, and she writes for a number of different publications. She writes for the Washington Examiner. I see her work at New York Post. The column today in the New York Post, she went to Youngstown, Ohio the other day. The 20,000 people who showed up, that's 3 times as many that could fit in the arena to hear the president the other night, and they came from far away, some from Michigan, some from Pennsylvania, some from West Virginia. And they were coming in early in the day for a speech that was taking place late in the evening, waiting in line for hours. Nothing has changed from when Mr. Trump, you kept hearing people dismiss this during the primary season last year. They kept saying, well, big crowds don't mean anything, and long lines don't mean anything. Well, it did. 922, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com. Quick note, we want to thank Russell Singleton from Tripp Family Medicine for joining us yesterday on the program. Russell was here, of course, talking about dependence on drugs, alcohol, and the like. We may pick that conversation up again in the near-term future, but just a reminder, Tripp Family Medicine still looking for new patients, and often as a patient of Dr. Tripp's office. They can see you on the very same day if you call early in the morning and you've got a medical ailment. The office is located on Fillmore Street in Twin Falls, directly across from the main post office. And remember, life's too short not to feel good. So this columnist at the New York Post suggests, not in any way directly in the column, but what I gathered is that if we've got a slow motion coup attempt going on against the president, and you've got some liberal writers who suggest we should have a coup against this president. If you've got 20,000 people who used to be steel workers and the like and former military, and they're showing up in Youngstown, Ohio, you try to take Trump out of office, whether it be Bob Mueller or the rank and file in the House and Senate or anybody else, you're going to have a bloodbath nationwide. This shows you that the American public, when I was reading the comments from the people who were at the Trump rally the other day, yeah, they'd be okay if he didn't tweet as much. But they think the Russia thing is a bunch of malarkey, and they are ready to go to the wall for this guy. We've got a caller with us. Caller, you're up next, and you're on KLIX. Go ahead. 736-0300, the number to reach us this morning. 736-0300. This is why the only complaint I have lately with Trump is lay off Jeff Sessions. Sessions is the one guy, your best friend in Washington, and while I disagree with Sessions on civil asset forfeiture, Congress can always remedy that on its own. On every other issue that Sessions is involved with, I'm on board with the guy, and I think the president has to say he's got to come out. Maybe, who knows? Maybe this whole thing has been just put together to find out who's leaking all of the stories. I don't think they put that much thought into it, though. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX on Top Story.
Yeah, that last caller, the lady, that was great that she called in. Nice hearing a female call in, but I was just going to say that Crapo, yeah, he's an establishment, just like the John McCains, that sort of thing. And, when he's up for re-election, he's always on the radio and stuff like that, but behind the scenes, they're always putting talk radio down and that sort of thing. And if you remember Crapo, during the election campaign, he was the first to jump ship when Trump had issues with that video coming out where he was grabbing a woman and that sort of thing. So he's never like Trump. So, yeah, he's just an establishment guy. He's got to get out of office.
I have not heard from Crapo's office. He was on this program about a year ago or so, but I have not heard from his office since he said that Trump should drop out of the race, because I wrote a post for our website where I pointed out telling dirty jokes never hurt anybody, but drunk drivers have. And
exactly.
So they've avoided me ever since then.
Yep, exactly. So if I may, you mentioned something about the fires in Shoshone. Every day I pass through there, and there's a business that burnt down. I don't know if you mentioned it. It was Sticks and Stones. It's like a fence company. It's just, yeah, they'll need some help up there, it looks like. So
it is a mess.
That was it. So
yeah, I was up there a couple of weeks ago looking over the previous damage, and this appears to be even worse.
Yeah, it is. It is. So, okay. Well, thanks, Bill.
Thank you much for the call. In fact, after the show today, I think we're going to be finding out from folks in the office what we're going to be able to put together, perhaps to help people out in that area who are suffering the damage from the fire. 9:26, and you're up next. You're on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Good morning, Bill. I don't know who the lady was who talked to you a few minutes ago, having been in Washington.
Boy, was she spot on, huh?
She was. What is the chance of you doing an online interview with her? Not that she's the ultimate or anything else, but she could give us some insight, since that is something we, as the average, we on the average don't get to hear the honest insight about what's going on back there.
Yeah, thank you for the call. And I had a friend who worked for many, many years on Capitol Hill in the office of a member of the House of Representatives, buddy from high school. He worked for a fellow named Amory Houghton, who's now retired and moved on. And Houghton was a pretty decent guy. The problem is, if you're a wealthy Republican, at one time he was the wealthiest member of Congress after John Hines was killed. The Houghton family, Corning Glass, or known as Steuben Glass around the country, they're the founders of that company. But Mr. Houghton was a pretty decent conservative guy. But on the other hand, like a lot of Republicans who come from that part of the country, the old Rockefeller Republicans, when push comes to shove, um, they look to please the other elites. And they really don't think. I grew up in Mr. Houghton's district. He's now been replaced by a guy named Tom Reed, who seems to be fairly ineffective. There have only been 2 Democrats who've served in that district since before the Civil War. Uh, but most of the Republicans at one time were considered to be stalwart conservatives, and now they're just go along, get along types. And nothing in that district, which is a huge geographic piece of land. When I was a kid growing up, there was a factory in my hometown that employed more people at one time that lived in my hometown. And if you didn't like your job there, you could quit the job and you could drive over the hill to a place called Arcade and get a job at the Motorola plant. And if you didn't like that, you could quit that job and you could go another 15 miles to the west and you could pick up a job with Dresser Industries. Or you could go 20 miles to the east and pick up a job with Dresser Industries or Worthington. It's all gone. And yet these people, I brought it up earlier, they show up at a campaign event or a local Tea Party meeting or your hometown while they're campaigning. And you're right, you don't see them otherwise. They're no shows. They're absolutely, gee, I got an election coming up. I better pretend I care. But they show up, and as I said earlier, it's like they hold up a picture of Ronald Reagan and say, see, I liked Ronald Reagan. Vote for me. There's an old photograph that I have in a book at home from World War I, about World War I, and it shows the Tsar of Russia addressing some of his troops, and he's holding up an icon. It's a painting of some saint in the Russian Orthodox Church, and he's holding up the icon. In other words, he came out to speak to the troops and said, here's Saint, come up with a name, Stanislaus or whoever. Aha, see? We're all blessed now. All right, go out there and die in front of the German machine guns. That's what it reminds me of with a lot of these Republicans. They show up and they hold up the picture of St. Ronald and say, aha, see? St. Ronald, you loved him, I loved him, vote for me. Well, we need a little bit more than that. And, if you have a U.S. senator who claims to be a very devout member of the LDS Church and he's out getting a snootful, and I don't think he's doing it likely anymore, then you've got to be asking yourself, well, how devout is he really in this situation? Now, as a Roman Catholic, I wouldn't have that issue. But neither does Jim Risch, although I don't think he drinks. So there you go, 9:30. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. It's 66. Headline I just happened to see at Bloomberg Technology today. Jeff Bezos surpasses Bill Gates as world's richest person. We heard a caller complaining earlier about money in politics. Well, Bezos and Gates are liberals. If you didn't already know that, Bezos is the founder of Amazon. And did you also hear that the story not long ago that in England they cracked down on Amazon? It was very quietly reported, I think, in this country. The Washington Post didn't report it, to my knowledge, at all because Bezos owns that newspaper, which is being used as a cudgel against Donald Trump and the American people. At the Amazon warehouses in England, they were locking people away and wouldn't allow them to even go to the bathroom and relieve themselves. But, I'm sure in Mr. Bezos' opinion, all the people that as a liberal that he's looking out for, well, golly gee, if you get a urinary tract infection because you couldn't pee at his business and you die, he can always find somebody else to work for peanuts. Yeah, these are your liberal buddies out there who prop up the Democrat Party, who tell you that they're out for everybody as well. Hey, quick note. I wanted to point out we are looking at some very warm weather again next week. Temperatures near triple digits or over triple digits in some areas. Once more, your AC unit is going to be working overtime to keep your home or your business cool. If you're having difficulty with efficiency or if the unit breaks down, you need to call right away. The pros at Ramsey Heating and Electric in Burley. They'll come out, get the job done right. They'll make sure the job is done right that very first time. Problem-free, cozy summers are found at Ramsey Heating and Electric, 2600 Overland Avenue in Burley. You can telephone them at 678-0459. That's 678-0459. Ramsey Heating and Electric, where they sell warm winters and cool summers. We've got a caller with us. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Bill, years ago, a husband and wife were executed because they gave our nuclear secrets to Russia. What the Clintons did was far worse because Hillary let Russia have 20% of our uranium that can be weaponized. Why aren't the GOP piñatas in Congress investigating the Clintons instead of Trump's family and friends?
Good question. And I read this morning where Debbie Wasserman Schultz's aide, her IT aide, well, he worked for several Democrats in the House of Representatives. The fellow was arrested trying to sneak out of the country the other day. His wife already left the country with the children. She's hiding out in Qatar. And he's also been wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars overseas. The New York Times and Jeff Bezos' Washington Post haven't covered that story. Not once. Not once. The guy was smashing the hard drives of his computers, and at one point he had a computer squirreled away in a crevice at the Capitol building. And when Capitol Police finally seized it, Debbie Wasserman Schultz demanded it back. Where again is the media on this story? Well, they're looking out for their fellow travelers. They're globalists. They're one-worlders like Jeff Bezos, who think the rest of us are useless eaters. This is Ann Navarro. She's a liberal who works for CNN, the Clinton News Network. And she says Trump supporters must be on drugs.
His base is, frankly, not budging, which is very impressive. But this conversation we're having today about him being the most presidential but for Abraham Lincoln, guys, I've never done hallucinogenic mushrooms, but when I watch one of these Trump rally speeches, I feel, okay, this is what it must be like to be high on hallucinogenic mushrooms. Because the stream
Allison
of
says it isn't.
That's
very different.
the stuff that comes out of his mouth, I mean, at some point, you just got to almost laugh at the absurdity. First of all, that somebody, 6 months into his presidency, he's comparing himself to the other 40 presidents, which have included great giants like Thomas Jefferson, like
Sure.
George Washington, like FDR, like Ronald Reagan.
When I was in high school, there were a handful of kids we knew who used drugs. They all ended up liberals. In college, the handful of students that we knew who used drugs, they were all liberals. Over the years working in media and having a pretty good pass through a number of different types of media, all the people I knew in the office who were rumored to be using drugs, they were liberals too. She says that the people who are at Trump rallies, this must be like a hallucinogenic experience for them. They must be taking what are called, magic mushrooms? It shows you again that the disdain that the Democrats have for actual working Americans in people like Youngstown and throughout flyover country, that you must be on drugs. And Trump, he's pulled the wool over your eyes, and you're ignoring that. Again, it's not, there are people out there, if I mention sometimes on my Facebook page, I'll criticize Trump. I've been criticizing him lately for his attacks on Sessions. And there are some people who support him, and they're as bad as the Obamaites, who you couldn't say anything bad about their guy. Never. He could do no wrong. They thought he walked on water. Well, look, Donald Trump and Barack Obama are not God. They are not. On the other hand, a lot of the people who support Donald Trump don't necessarily support him because he's Donald Trump, the reality TV star or the billionaire. They support him because he's the first guy who's come along in their lifetimes who said enough and pointed the finger directly where it needed to be pointed at, and that is the swamp in Washington and in many state capitals and in some county seats. That's why they support him. And Lefty just wants to get a few more men who think they're girls or vice versa into the Army. And they can't understand why you across flyover country just can't understand that. What are you on, a job or something? For crying out loud. We've got more coming up. Subject of health care in a couple of minutes. On Top Story with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310. KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 68. I had a friend when I first got involved in the Tea Party movement by the name of Larry Mayo. Larry was a businessman. He owned if you needed your bathroom remodeled, Larry could come out and do it. And he was one of these guys, he was working 6 days a week and 16 hours a day. And that's how he was able to put food on the table for his family. And he was a brilliant guy. He just, hard worker. And he was always looking for somebody he could put his trust in. And like the rest of us, found it very difficult when it came to politicians of any particular political party. Larry has this post at Facebook that he posted a little earlier this morning. And he writes, "Let me get this straight. In 2016, the president's national security advisor was an Iranian. The head of the CIA was a Muslim. The DNC IT specialist was a Pakistani who lost his security clearance. The Democrat candidate's chief of staff was an Iranian. That candidate was instrumental in Russia acquiring 20% of the U.S. uranium reserves. Her charitable foundation accepted millions in donations from just about every evil nation on the planet, not to mention that progressives have been colluding with Russia since Stalin. But Donald Trump, a devout capitalist from New York who ran on putting America first, a strong military, opening up our oil production and manufacturing, is under investigation. What's worse? Half our population buys into this? And Brennan at the CIA, he was a communist, an admitted communist, and yet you see him on network TV and being praised. I referenced John McCain earlier in his speech this week, which the liberals fawned all over. Oh, John McCain came back to the Senate. Oh, the dying man gave a speech for the ages. Look, folks, I heard it. It was okay. It wasn't necessarily what you'd call. In other words, he said, we all need to get together and get along together again. And we don't get along anymore. So he came back and he gave this speech. It was not 7 years ago. It was not the Gettysburg Address. Let me assure you of that. 944. And 100 years from now, historians will not be quoting John McCain's return speech to the U.S. Senate, telling his colleagues to get the lead out and, we all need to cooperate and get along. And then he wasn't criticizing people like me. He doesn't know me, but he went after, obviously, especially Rush Limbaugh, because Limbaugh does such a spot-on impersonation of McCain. And for years, Limbaugh has pointed out that John McCain, when it comes to a lot of the more serious issues of our day, is more than willing to sell his soul. People say, well, Bill, but he was an American hero. After the Battle of Saratoga, where he saved his army, he saved the Revolutionary Army, and he was badly wounded, the man who was considered the greatest American of his day was a fellow named Benedict Arnold. And if he had died from his wounds at Saratoga today, we would have cities across the country named after him and statues in every town across the country. But after Saratoga, he sold his country out. And I think that's the feeling of a lot of Americans when it comes to John McCain is he hasn't done nearly enough other than sit there and preen for the media because he likes to be praised. And during the 2008 primaries, when the media kept fawning all over him, you knew what was going to happen. They set up the candidate they knew would be easiest to beat for the Democrats. And as soon as McCain got the nomination, then he was a bad dude and Obama was cool. And I had a call from a guy on the radio one day who was quoting somebody in media who was pointed out that John McCain doesn't even know how to use a computer. That's how uncool he is. Well, you know why John McCain doesn't sit there pecking away at a keyboard? And he doesn't use Twitter or any of those things? Because he can't. Because of his wounds from the war. He can't do it. He can't even button his own shirts because of his wounds from the war. Yet media wouldn't explain this about him. But the election was over, he lost, and then immediately after he was done and he was toast and he wasn't going to be president, media suddenly fell in love with him again. And when he criticizes, remember when he had that long rambling statement when he was questioning a witness in a hearing about a month and a half ago? And everybody said, John McCain's lost it. Media was like, it must be dementia. John McCain, oh, man, he should have retired a long time ago. And then it was identified as brain cancer. And, of course, they wouldn't come out and say, well, gee, we're sorry. We said all those things about him. Now he comes and gives a speech where he raps talk radio, and they're, oh, yes, it's reminiscent of Cicero. Yes. No, the Abraham Lincoln couldn't have given a better speech. That flip-flopping that the media does on all of this. And McCain doesn't like talk radio because talk radio is truly a representation of democracy in this country. And again, I hear politicians say, well, it's talk radio, so we take it with a grain of salt. There is an old line that used to be said that if your member of the House of Representatives or your senator got a letter that it represented the views of 1,000 constituents. Well, it is true that less than 1% of the population will ever call, and that's on the local level too, will ever call a talk radio program. But that's because a lot of people, we had a guy who called my show one day. I hear from him on a regular basis. And I just quickly referenced him by his name. And when he got home that night, he had a threatening message on his phone at home somebody had heard him and decided to call and threaten him. There's a reason a lot of people don't call talk radio shows. And if you live in a smaller city like this, your voice can often be recognized by friends, neighbors, people you work for, your boss, etc. So people may even feel compelled to call, but for safety and security reasons, they don't do it. And I don't blame them. If somebody's leaving me threatening messages, I have an issue with that too. So that may be one reason that people don't call the radio show. Others, public speaking is difficult for them, whether it be on a radio program or in front of a small crowd. It's just not easy. When I walk out of here, I've been invited to give a speech in September at an event on the local level. And I have to admit, I sit in here and all I can see in front of me is 2 computer screens, my email, and my Facebook page. That's all I've got in front of me right now as I'm talking with you. And there are no windows in this room, so I can't even see outside. It was raining earlier. I don't know if it's still raining. So it's easy to sit here and do this because the only thing that's in my presence staring back at me is a picture of myself on my Facebook page. I was joking about the Washington Nationals with Raul Labrador earlier, and that Facebook page picture is actually me wearing my Nationals cap at a Cubs-Nationals game in Washington. But if I go out and give a speech in front of a crowd in public, it's a little more difficult for me. And I've been doing this speaking in public for years, whether it be in front of organizations or at political rallies, through the time I was on TV years ago and still in radio, and it's not easy. So when I hear all these people dismiss talk radio, they're missing out on something. And the undercurrent you hear on talk radio, especially, it's grown, but it's been there for the last 30 years since Limbaugh first came on the stage. But we're hearing a change. You're hearing a desperation from callers, and people say, oh, well, they're angry. Well, they're angry, and they have a right to be angry. That's the difference. They're not angry about nothing. 10 minutes away from 10 o'clock. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on Top Story. Go ahead.
Well, that's when you talk about angry, people are just tired of both parties doing nothing, having no gumption to push forward on Obamacare or any of these things. But like I say, the flip-flop of McCain and the media in regard to that, it's all about bringing this country down to its knees, making us a third world country. This is what they just want, and then they'll want to destroy our culture either by bringing in refugees that will not assimilate, want to bring their culture in here and convert us to their method of living and so forth. But the media just is on the side of the New World Order crowd, and regardless, and we've got plenty of the Republicans.
That's because the media gets paid, right? Here at the Washington Post, you're getting paid by a guy who helps run the New World Order.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you got this group called the Council on Foreign Relations. And like I say, I've mentioned before, you get the book out called Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. It was printed in the 60s, and Carol Quigley was Bill Clinton's mentor. And Bill Clinton even mentioned Quigley. But if you read the book, the original copy, of course, they sanitized it because it was told too much that both major parties are controlled by the same elitist that want world government. And of course, that world government is the United Nations. And we need to get out of that organization to stop, because it's always been controlled by the Secretary General, from Alger Hiss to the President. It's always been either a Marxist or a socialist, certainly many communists. So we've had no control. They've been against us in voting and so forth. All these nations, 190 some of them, they love our money and they vote against us. There's only about 6 nations in the world that are actually pro-USA. And of course, we're trying to take out Israel, or at least Obama did, and so forth. But you're right, Bill. Your program and others like it throughout the country have been a spark plug and have given a breath of fresh air to all of this nonsense that we hear from day to day or read in the liberal rag, which has got Bloomberg, Washington Post. This stuff is just trash. And if you NPR radio, I've got a relative that listens to NPR radio and is very anti-Trump. I listened for a little while one day, and I mean, it's just unbelievable, the trash that comes out.
Yeah.
The lies, distortions, and so forth. So, folks, you got to be diligent, but call our congressmen, senators, They take an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution, and they don't do it. But I would like to take the opportunity to invite everybody that's interested in learning more about
the film tonight
at 7:30 CSI Taylor Building upstairs, room 277. No admission charge, a 1 hour DVD. It'll give you some education about what's going on.
Hey, super. Thank you. Good hearing from you today. Not everybody in politics is a scoundrel. I cited Raul Labrador earlier as being, I think, one of the better people. He is actually a close friend of Mike Lee, who's a senator from neighboring Utah. Mike Lee has a column today, guest column at the Daily Signal. He says, men and women are having fewer children in total, and they are also having fewer children within wedlock. And the number of illegitimate births is up to 40% in America. Americans are spending less time in religious communities. Church attendance and trust in organized religion have dropped sharply since the early 70s. Americans also participate less in secular voluntary associations such as Scouting and Rotary International, groups that historically have brought together people from different walks of life. Much of the blame goes to the federal government, which has intruded into aspects of life that used to be the sole domain of civil society. Government crowds out civic groups by competing with them to perform similar social functions. Robbed of purpose by a competitor they cannot outspend, these civic groups wither, leaving behind an empty public square. Now, this is a much longer column. He says a turn toward localism stands a chance of actually yielding a happier, healthier republic. Actually, what Mike Lee is suggesting is something called, in my church, subsidiarity, and that means you turn over all of these huge government programs and local issues to the local government or your local communities, your churches, your other service groups. Let me put it this way. Do you think that perhaps people on the local level could come up with better solutions when it comes to health care? You bet. But your big government, which wants control, won't allow it to happen. It's 9:55. We've got a couple of minutes to go. Caller, you're up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Hi. I was just thinking about your comments earlier about why people don't call the radio station or why they don't put letters in the editor. And I think it's intimidation. I think we tend to feel intimidated by things that are going on. Say, like the guys that are being, convicted of these crimes for defending the Bundy thing. 58 years or whatever is crazy. But I know that as citizens, if we don't stand up, we don't get educated, we become sheeple, and the government has the thumb on us. So we need to do what we can to participate in everything that's available to us. The elections, making sure we elect good, honest people, look for solutions locally. There is an education, a previous caller talked about regular education video available to all the public. It's on the fourth Thursday at 7:30 at CSI Taylor Building, room 277. Tonight we're focusing on the environmental movement and how it's being used to push control over our lives. So,
good point. Good point. And I wish I had a longer show. Thank you for the call, because some of these European countries are going to phase out the internal combustion engine to save the planet. Well, of course, it's like driving across the state of Massachusetts. You can't do that in this country because it's so much bigger. But quickly, too, I got to mention the whole situation with the folks who supported the Bundys and then later the Hammonds in Oregon. Even a lot of the better people in politics are saying, yes, but this was not the solution. This was not the way to go about it. They shouldn't have done it. What are they supposed to do? Do the Hammonds have to die in prison? Well, no. Well, then what are they supposed to do? If you're going to talk about how we have to restore people's rights and liberties in this country, and you want them to wait and wither away in prison while you do it? Well, I have other priorities we have to handle. You don't get anything done in the first place. No wonder people are taking it into their own hands, and that's my argument with that. Was it a good idea to take over the wildlife refuge? In hindsight, no. But you know what? If they hadn't done it, at least it brought some attention to the issue. And I've got to tell you, you've got people out there in politics, they got to get off their dead asses and start actually doing the right thing. And then people wouldn't have to take these matters into their own hands. It's only going to get worse in this country if that doesn't happen. As I said earlier, these people who showed up at that rally in Youngstown, Ohio the other day, if somebody tries to take Trump out, whether it be Robert Mueller or even Trump's own party or Democrats, whoever, it's going to get mightily nasty out there. And I don't think, judging by how well the swells live in places like the Washington Beltway or on the two different coasts, that they have a clue how things are going to get ugly here. They better not come driving through this part of the country. That's all you can tell them. God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'll be back here tomorrow morning. I think we're talking firearms tomorrow between 9 and 10 o'clock. Right now, we're at 70. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Rush Limbaugh's program follows Fox News at 10 o'clock.